He who sees farther than others must behave as if he does not. Niccolo Machiavelli. Let that sink in. Because maybe, just maybe, you've always seen things a little too clearly. The room shifts before anyone says a word. You can tell who's pretending, who's hiding, and who's desperately holding it together. Their success doesn't impress you. Their charm doesn't distract you. Their laughter feels forced, like a signal more than a sound. And then it hits you. Why am I the only one noticing this? Am I broken? Overthinking? Too sensitive? But Carl Jung had a better explanation. He called it dangerous perception, a kind of consciousness that sees through masks and makes others uncomfortable just by existing. You're not broken. You're not paranoid. You're awake in a world that's rewarded for staying asleep. And when you see what others won't, you stop being accepted. You start being feared. But here's the twist. That's not a punishment. It's an invitation. Because the people who see what others don't, they weren't made to fit in. They were made to shift the entire frequency of the room, silently, strategically, unapologetically. Ever notice how exhausted you feel after small talk? Not because the words are tiring, but because the performance is obvious. You're watching a scene that everyone else believes is real, but you see the lighting, the stage, the shaky actors trying to keep the show together. They say things like, "Everything's great. I love my job. We're just so happy right now." But you can feel the quiet tension between the lines, the fidgeting, the glances, the energy that doesn't match the script. And here's the painful part. When you say nothing, you feel fake. When you say something real, they say you're too intense. You are not too much. You're just unwilling to pretend. You see what others deny. And in a society built on denial, clarity is a curse. It makes people uncomfortable. Not because of what you say, but because of what you reflect. They don't reject you because you're wrong. They reject you because you remind them of everything they've buried. And the more honest you are, the more their masks start to crack. You've felt it. You walk into a room, and suddenly, the atmosphere tightens. People smile a little less. They wrap up conversations quickly. They glance at you, and then look away just as fast. You haven't said a word. You didn't challenge anyone. You didn't correct or criticize or dominate. You simply existed, with presence, stillness, and awareness. But something in your stillness mirrors something in them they're not ready to see. Because the moment a person who doesn't play the game shows up, everyone playing it becomes aware that it's a game. And no one likes being reminded of their own performance. So what do? They project. They call you cold, arrogant, too serious, hard to connect with. But here's the truth they'll never admit. They fear your perception more than they value your approval. You don't laugh on cue. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't validate their illusions just to be liked. And in a world where social survival depends on mutual deception, the person who refuses to participate becomes the enemy. Not because they're dangerous with words, but because they're dangerous with truth. You don't just see people, you see through them, and they can feel it, long before they understand it. Why silence isn't your weakness, it's your weapon. And how speaking less can turn you into the most powerful person in the room. They think you're quiet because you're shy, because you lack confidence, because you have nothing to say. But silence, when used by someone who sees deeply, is not passivity. It's pressure. You're not silent because you're weak. You're silent because you've already seen the whole game play out. You've read the energy, you've measured the people, and you've already decided this isn't worth responding to. Most people talk to fill the void. You stay quiet to own it. In every group, there's a loud one, a funny one, a charming one. But the one they can't stop watching? is the one they can't read, the one who listens too well, the one who looks like he already knows something. And that's you. Not because you're trying to be mysterious, but because you're done performing. You no longer need to prove anything. And when you stop needing to be liked, you become someone they can't manipulate. They'll wonder what you're thinking. They'll feel exposed around you. And without even trying, you start shifting the power dynamic in every room you enter. That's what clarity does. It doesn't just change your perspective, it changes the atmosphere. What if I told you the isolation you've experienced wasn't punishment, but preparation? In the next part, we'll explore why the world keeps pushing people like you to the edges, and what happens when you stop trying to belong. Let's be honest. You've spent a long time trying to figure out why you never fully belong. You're included, but not embraced. Respected, but kept at a distance. Heard, but never fully understood. And somewhere along the way, you started to believe that maybe the problem was you. But what if exile wasn't a failure of connection, but a side effect of perception? What if your isolation was the evidence that you've outgrown the collective illusion? Carl Jung said, "The more you wake up, the more alone you become, because fewer and fewer people can meet you where you are. You see too clearly. You feel too deeply. You notice the lies too fast. And the world? It's not designed to welcome people like that. Because in a society built on performance, truth-tellers aren't celebrated. They're cast out. You don't belong in surface-level conversations. You don't enjoy hollow praise. You don't pretend to be impressed by what doesn't move your soul. And so, the system quietly removes you, not with violence, but with distance. You don't get kicked out. You just stop getting invited in. But here's the twist. And it matters. Your isolation didn't mean you were unworthy. It meant you couldn't be used. And that's a very different story. What if the very traits that made you feel too much were actually the tools of transformation? The next segment will shift how you see your depth and how you use it. They told you, you're too sensitive. You overthink everything. You're too intense, too emotional, too complicated. And maybe you believed them for a while. Maybe you tried to shrink, tried to soften your tone, dull your edges, laugh at what wasn't funny, just to belong, just to be less threatening. But here's the truth. The things they rejected were never flaws. They were functions. Your sensitivity? It's not fragility. It's precision. You can detect emotional shifts others never even feel. You hear what isn't said. You read what no one's confessing. Your depth, not a burden, but a blueprint. While others are busy running from themselves, you're built to navigate the labyrinth of the soul with courage and clarity. The world doesn't need more agreeable people. It needs people who can sit in the fire and name what's burning. And you? You were made for the fire. You weren't cursed with intensity. You were gifted with fuel. The reason they called you too much is because your presence asks more of them. More honesty, more awareness, more depth. And that scares them. But here's what they don't know. Every trait they tried to suppress in you is exactly what the next version of this world is starving for. But before you rise into that role, there's one final obstacle. In the next segment, we'll uncover the silent war within yourself and why your deepest battle has never been with the world, but with your own desire to be accepted. Let's be honest. You've spent years mastering how to hide, not physically, emotionally, energetically, spiritually. You learned how to water yourself down, just enough to not intimidate, just enough to be included, just enough to survive in rooms that could never hold your fullness. You became skilled at fragmentation. There was a version of you for work, a version for family, a version for people who couldn't handle too much. But none of them were you. And the cost? It wasn't just exhaustion. It was self-abandonment. You traded authenticity for approval, depth for comfort, truth for silence. And somewhere along the way, you started to forget the sound of your own voice, the one that never needed to perform. Jung called this the divided self, the part of you that knows who you are, and the part of you that learned it wasn't safe to be that. And here's the paradox. You were exiled not because they rejected you, but because you rejected your own power to stay acceptable. That's the real war, the internal fracture. Because the danger of seeing what others don't is realizing how often you've betrayed what you see, just to stay where you were, never meant to belong. We'll explore the exact moment your silence becomes a source of power, and how your truth, once hidden, becomes the force that changes the room without ever raising your voice. At some point, you stopped trying to be understood, not out of bitterness, not out of defeat, but because you realized understanding wasn't the point anymore. You didn't need them to agree. You didn't need them to approve. You didn't even need them to see you clearly, because for the first time you saw yourself clearly, and that made all the difference. You realized that truth in the wrong room isn't noble, it's dangerous, and survival, for people like you, doesn't mean shouting louder. It means choosing where and when to speak with surgical precision. That's when the silence began. Not the silence of fear, the silence of calculation. You started noticing things others missed. Who needed validation to function? Who feared eye contact? Who asked questions just to hear themselves talk? And while they filled the space with noise, you became the one person they couldn't predict. Because you weren't playing to be liked. You were observing to lead. And here's the twist. The less you explained yourself, the more power your presence carried. Because silence, when it's grounded in self-awareness, isn't emptiness. It's pressure. The kind that makes insecure people sweat. The kind that makes liars stutter. The kind that makes the room reorient itself around the one who doesn't need attention to control it. But silence alone isn't power, unless you know how to hold it. In the next segment, we'll explore how to weaponize your presence without saying a word, and why the most dangerous person in any room is the one no one can figure out. Think about it. The loudest person might get attention, but the one who can't be read? He owns the room. Because people don't fear volume. They fear ambiguity. They fear unpredictability. They fear the unknown, especially when it's silent and watching. You don't talk over people. You don't interrupt to prove you're smart. You don't need to raise your hand to be respected, because you've learned something they haven't. When you hold back your thoughts, you control theirs. When you don't reveal what you're thinking, people project their own fears, doubts, insecurities onto you. And without even trying, you become larger in their minds than you are in the moment. That's the power of psychological space. It's the reason lions don't roar when they walk into the jungle. They don't need to. Everyone already feels them. And you've become the same. You stopped chasing validation, and that absence created a gravitational pull. You're not mysterious because you're hiding something. You're powerful because you've mastered what not to reveal. And while others scramble to be seen, you've realized something far more dangerous. There's more control in what you withhold than in anything you could possibly say. But presence alone isn't enough. We'll uncover the moment when your perception becomes leadership, and why the world quietly starts following the person who stopped asking for approval. It happens quietly. You don't make a speech. You don't ask for attention. You simply withdraw your need for it. And the shift begins. People who once dismissed you start leaning in. They sense something's changed. They can't name it, but they can feel it. Because you're no longer trying to be accepted. You've accepted yourself. And when you do that, something strange happens. You become an axis. The room begins to orient around you, not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. While others twist themselves to be liked, you remain still. And in that stillness, you become a mirror. Some people will run from that. Others will return to you like gravity, because your presence does what no performance can. It gives people permission to stop pretending. That's the beginning of leadership. Not the loud kind, not the bossy kind, but the kind that people trust without fully knowing why. Because there's something about you, something anchored, something steady, something dangerous, in the best possible way. You've stopped trying to prove your value, and in doing so, you've become undeniable. But now comes the real turning point, because all this silence, this depth, this exile, it wasn't for nothing. Let's stop pretending. You weren't made for shallow waters. You weren't designed to thrive in noise, in groupthink, in surface-level goals. From the beginning, your perception has been too wide, your questions too inconvenient, your awareness too early. And that's why life felt heavy. That's why you were always on the edge, watching instead of participating, sensing things others ignored, feeling like you landed here by mistake. But what if it wasn't a mistake at all? What if the way you see things, the clarity, the emotional weight, the depth that isolates you, isn't the defect? What if it's the assignment? Carl Jung called it individuation, the lifelong path of becoming who you truly are, not by adding more, but by shedding everything that isn't you. And Machiavelli understood it differently. He who sees farther must act as if he does not because he is weak, but because his timing is precise, strategic, chosen. You were never here to be loud. You were here to be accurate. Your presence wasn't designed to entertain. It was meant to recalibrate the spaces you enter, to shift conversations, reveal shadows, and awaken those who are ready. The truth is, you were never here to blend in. You were born to hold the line, so others would remember where the truth actually is. So, if this has resonated with you, if you've spent years doubting your perception, shrinking to be tolerated, or silencing yourself just to survive, this is your reminder. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're just rare. And rare was never meant to be comfortable. Rare was meant to be necessary. So stop apologizing for what you see. Stop asking for permission to be who you are. And stop trying to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need their validation. You need your clarity and the courage to stand inside it. Because somewhere out there is a room, a person, a conversation that's been waiting for the version of you that no longer hides. So let that version step forward. Silently, strategically, powerfully. Drop a comment below. I see. I wait. I act. Let that be your declaration, not of rebellion, but of sovereign perception. Subscribe for more deep, faceless, unapologetic clarity every week. And share this with someone who's been doubting their vision for too long. Because if you're still watching, you weren't just meant to see clearly. You were meant to change what people see.